Hello and welcome to Believe, Yeshua, and Live. I'm Larry. We're going to be continuing on to this series on the book of Esther. It's going to be part 2 of 3 of my notes to a video. Of course, it's going to be about Queen Esther, Xerxes, and the foolish aristocrats. Before we get into the chapter, remember at the end of the last chapter, the king and Haman were drinking, but the people of the city were baffled about the decree. With this said, let's get into chapter 4. The story shifts over to Malachi and how he learned all that has happened and what's in the decree. And he tore his clothing and put sackcloth and ashes, and outcried with shouting and loud bitterness throughout the city, the capital city. While returning back to his seat at the front gate, because he was an official, he was turned away because he was wearing sackcloth and ashes. And this was not permitted under the Persian law. It's apparent that Queen Esther did not know about the decree because one of her female attendants told her about the Malachi and his sackcloth and ashes in mourning. Then she ordered one of the attendants to find out what was going on with him. Malachi told the attendant that she sent what had happened to him, including the amount of money Haman had promised to pay into the treasury for the destruction of the Jewish people. He also gave the attendant a copy of the decree to take to Queen Esther, and also to instruct her to talk to the king and beg for mercy and plead for her people. But she gives an excuse, being someone that isn't invited to the king, and there is a law stating anybody that approaches the king without being summoned will be put to death, and most likely she's not interested in being executed. But Mordecai isn't taking no for an answer. So he sends an attendant his response telling her she will not be spared from the law because she is a queen. In other words, if she doesn't speak up, she's guaranteed to die. We could face this kind of dilemma, maybe not this intense, maybe someone has at one time in their life, but many people desperately are wanting to avoid doing God's will because it could mean loss of friendship, status, wealth, and maybe even their own life. Because there is no guarantee of the outcome that we see will be in our favor. We may even hope someone else will take up the reins. Now going back to the story of Malachi, he tells her this is the moment that what is always have been about. So Queen Esther made her choice and took up the reins, gathered together the Jews of Susa and her attendants, and told them to fast for 3 days, which means no eating or drinking, and she will do the same. Then after the 3 days she said, I will go against the Persian law. Even if I perish, I perish. She put her trust and her fate into Yahweh, God our Elohim's hands. Okay, moving on to chapter 5. This is a critical moment in the story, and most likely she was praying to Yahweh during those 3 days of fasting. She may have also been given a plan from Yahweh himself, maybe through directly spoken words or put thoughts in her head. Then after the 3 days of fasting, Esther put on her golden robes, meaning this was an official business. Then she walked into the inner court of the palace, in front of the king's hall. This was probably one of the most terrifying or maybe in the most peaceful moments in her life. The king was sitting on his throne and saw her approaching. In keeping with tradition and laws, the king extended his golden scepter towards her, approving her entering. The king then asked Esther the queen, what is troubling you? The king, knowing Esther's personality and knowing that she would not violate Persian law unless something was vitally important to her, we see this when he says, I'll give you half my kingdom. But then all she asked was for Haman and him to attend a banquet that she had prepared. So they all went to the banquet. While at the banquet, the king asked for her request. But then she asked the king, let them come tomorrow to another banquet and she will answer the king's question. Then the story shifts over to Haman leaving the banquet, and he's all giddy and happy. But then he walks past Mordecai sitting at the gate, and of course Mordecai does not acknowledge him, does not stand. This outraged Haman, but he shows restraint. Instead, he goes home. While at home, Haman boasts on his vast wealth and all the ways the king honored him, and him being the only government official that Queen Esther invited him to accompany the king at the banquet she gave, and even tomorrow as well. But as we see, Haman is still obsessed with Mordecai sitting at the gate. Why such hate towards Mordecai and even to all the Jews in the land? This is a shame and honor issue, but mostly a spiritual issue, not a political one. Sadly, today the same spirit is alive and has been dominant for many centuries and in many countries. That said, there needs to be a Jewish awakening to their and our Messiah, Yeshua, Jesus. And there is. Why? Because there is no other deliverance possible for the current spiritual condition. Okay, continuing on the story. His wife and all his friends tell him to set up a large pole close to his home, then tomorrow ask the king to impale Mordecai on it. And of course, this delights Haman, and he sets up the pole. Now the story in chapter 6 changes to King Xerxes. And remember, this is all happening in a 2-day window. Now that night, the king couldn't fall asleep, so he ordered the chronicles to be read to him until he falls asleep. As it was being read, it happened to come upon the assassination attempt of him, and how Mordecai saved his life. But he doesn't recall rewarding Malachi, and there wasn't anything written in the chronicles. So he wanted to reward Mordecai, and he asked if any was in the outer court. And the servant said, Haman. So the king let him in. Then the king immediately asked Haman, what should be done for a man the king wants to honor? Remember, Haman was there to ask the king to allow him to kill Mordecai the Jew. But of course, Haman being so self-centered, and his ego was already sky high because of the banquet he just had with the king and queen. So Haman just assumes the king is speaking about him. So Haman, being Haman, said, put the royal robe on him, put him on the king's horse with a crown on his head, and have a high-ranking official lead him around the square, proclaiming, this is what shall be done for a man whom the king desires to honor. So the king Xerxes said, you go and do what you have said, leave nothing out, and you do this for Mordecai the Jew. Once again, shame arises because it's known throughout the capital city, the hatred between Mordecai and Haman. But Haman was not going to be stupid and not obey the king's order. Then afterwards, he went home and told his wife and his friends what happened. They told him since he was the one that ordered the death of all the Israelites, the Jews, now the king sees Mordecai as a valuable ally. While they were talking, one of the king's attendants arrived to bring him to the banquet which Esther prepared. Haman has just dumped dirt onto his own grave. The next video will be part 3 of 3, which will be chapters 7, 8, 9, and 10. Thank you for watching.